Section 3.5, Roles of Functions. Functions are used in many different roles in programming. At a high level, programs are functions that, often, call other functions. Critically, all programs, including Python programs, originate with a single function, named main in languages such as Java, C, and C++. Python's main function is essentially the first line of code that isn't in a function. But if every program starts with a single function, and trying to solve a large problem with a single function is a mistake, how does that work? Well, main will call other functions, which in turn will call other functions, and so forth. The code will still execute, mostly, sequentially in each function, so it may start in main but then move to another function, and so on. As an example, let's use the code in the following listing. We wrote this code, not Copilot, because no one would ever want to write this code for anything useful outside of teaching. It's just for demonstrating how function calls work.
Listing 3.1, Code to demonstrate how Python handles function calls.
If we ran this program, the output would be, we'll explain why next.
See this code?
In Figure 3.5, we provide a diagram of how the code in Listing 3.1 would be executed by the computer. We've intentionally provided an example that has many function calls to tie together what we just learned. Again, this is not practical code. It's just for learning purposes. Let's trace through the code execution together. It may be easier to refer to Figure 3.5 than Listing 3.1 as you follow along, but either will work.
Figure 3.5, Flow of function execution in our example from Listing 3.1.
The program will start execution with the first line in the Python code that isn't a function, print hi. Although Python doesn't have a main function per se, we'll refer to the block of code after the functions as main to help with this explanation. Code executes sequentially unless it encounters commands that tell it to execute code somewhere else. So, after executing print hi, it will go to the next line, which is the call to funct1, funct1. The call to funct1 changes where the code is executing to the start of that function, which is the following statement, print there. The next line of funct1 calls funct2, so the program will execute the first line of funct2, print my. What gets interesting is what happens when funct2 finishes. There are no more lines of code to execute, so it automatically moves execution back to the first line following the call to funct2 in funct1. If the function call is in the middle of another statement, that statement resumes execution. But for this example, the function calls are each on their own line. You may be curious why it goes to the next line after the call to funct2 rather than back to the call of funct2. The problem is if it returned back to the call to funct2, it would be trapped calling funct2 forever. As a result, functions always return back to the next piece of code to execute, in this example the next line, after they are called. Continuing this example, the next line of the code executed will be the line that prints friend. The next line calls funct3, which prints a period, and then returns back to its caller. So we're back in funct1 on the line print an empty string. Printing an empty piece of text causes a new line. Now funct1 is finished, so it transfers execution back to the next line in main after it was called. We suspect you're getting the idea by now, so let's move a bit more quickly. Main next prints I'm and then calls funct4. Funct4 prints well and then returns to main where the next line of code calls funct3. Funct3 prints a period, and then returns to main. Notice that funct3 was called both by funct1 and by main, but that's okay because functions remember how to return to the function that called them. In fact, having multiple functions calling the same function is a sign that the function being called multiple times is a good function because of its reuse. After funct3 returns to main, it will print an empty string, which causes a new line to be started, and then it prints the word by. That was a long example, but we provided it to give you an idea of how functions execute and how programs consist of defining and calling functions. In any software you use, think about the specific tasks that it performs. The programmers probably wrote one or more functions for each one. The button in a text editor that changes the text to bold probably calls a function to change the text to bold. That function might change the editor's internal idea of the text. The editor likely stores your text in a different format than how you view it. And then it might call another function that updates the user's, your, view of the text. We'd also like to use this example to discuss the different roles that functions play. A helper function is a function whose job is to make another function's job easier. In a sense, every function that isn't main is a helper function. The best helper functions are those that carry out some small, well-defined part of some other task, such as our isStrongPassword function in section 3.3.2 serving as a helper function for our getStrongPassword function in section 3.3.3. Some functions simply call a bunch of other functions without doing any of their own work. There aren't any of these in our example. However, if you removed the 3 print statements from funct1, it becomes this type of coordinating function. Others may call helper function or functions, and then do some work on their own. Funct1 is a great example of a function that calls other functions, but also does work on its own. Another type of function, which we call a leaf function, stands on its own without calling other functions for help, except perhaps functions that already come with Python. Why leaf? If you imagine all the function calls as a big tree, these functions are the leaves of the tree because they have nothing coming out of them. Funct2, funct3, and funct4 are all leaf functions in our example. We're primarily concerned with leaf functions in this chapter, but you'll see examples of other kinds of functions here, and especially in later chapters.